Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing to make our final descent into the Gray Avenue. The local time is what it is, and the temperature is good degrees. This is where curious minds, entrepreneurs, daredevils, hustlers, and problem solvers converge. On your left is the world of productivity and success, home of the unicorns themselves. For your safety and comfort, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until the captain turns off the fasten seatbelt sign. On behalf of the entire crew, I'd like to thank you for listening to the Gray Ave podcast, where all dreams do come true.
Hey, what's up, guys? How's it going? My name is Gray, and this is another episode of the Gray F podcast. I'm recording this from the city of Johannesburg. It's quite a warm day. Not as warm, something like that, but warmer than Cape Town, which is what I'm used to. And it's really awesome. It's a Sunday morning, and last night was a fight with Mayweather against McGregor. So I slept really late, and I just woke up. And the Grey F podcast is a show where curious minds, entrepreneurs, daredevils, hustlers, and problem solvers converge. Each episode features a guest from a different walk of life, industry, and expertise. Whether it's tech, innovators, business leaders, we explore the failures, successes, and most importantly, lessons that contributed to the way they are living today. And today is no different. We have Marcello Schermer. Marcello, I apologize if I am mispronouncing your surname here, but his passion lies in building scalable products and platforms to help entrepreneurs in Africa succeed. In his previous role as a regional manager for Africa at Seedstars World, he worked on analyzing over 20 entrepreneurship ecosystems on the continent while finding and supporting the best local startups and connect them to the right investors, partners, and countries to fuel their growth. And at the moment, he is leading the expansion team for Yoko. That's in Johannesburg now. He's based in Johannesburg. And for most of you who listen to the podcast are familiar with Yoko. I had the CEO of the company on episode 50. For some of you, you might want to listen to it now. It's episode 50 with Katlego Mapai, who is the CEO of Yoko. It's a fintech company helping small businesses to be able to use cards as a form of payment. So Marcello, he is really involved in Africa startups and tech. And for some of you, you've probably watched his TEDx talk in Vienna, where he was talking about what he has seen in Africa as far as entrepreneurship and innovation. The TED talk is called I Got to Witness the African Startup Revolution. You can check it out on TEDx, and I'll put the link in the description. And so that's pretty much about it. I'll put everything else in the show notes, the link to the TED talk, his Twitter, and some of the links, especially companies that he mentioned in our conversation. So yeah, I hope you find it helpful, and let me know what you think in the comments. And you can obviously tweet to Marcello if you want on Twitter. The link will be available for you. And this is, I don't even know what episode this is, like what number. It's almost 60 now. We have done so many episodes, guys. So for those of you who did not know, you can go and download all these episodes for free. Whatever you want to listen to, whatever you feel like listening to at the moment, you can just go on my website, greyjabesi.com, greyjabesi.com. We're also on iTunes, the Grey F Podcast, on SoundCloud, on TuneIn, on Stitcher Radio. We're all over the place. So that's something to keep in mind. And remember to support the podcast just by leaving a review on iTunes and giving us a 5-star. You just have to write what you think about the podcast, be as honest as possible so that I can also have room to improve it. And this is episode 59. So we have done almost 60, like you can see, over a year. And thank you guys for the support as far as those who have been here since the beginning. Okay, enjoy my conversation with Marcello. Thank you.
I'm Marcello. Hi, everyone. I run the expansion team at a fintech company called Yoko. We're a Cape Town-based company that offers mobile point-of-sale solutions. And as part of the expansion team, we basically look into taking the company to new markets. So I'm actively looking at taking the company to new markets outside of South Africa. So I'm very much looking into, the interesting countries, interesting industries, interesting places for us to go to. And before joining Yoko, I was the regional manager for Africa at Seedstars. So I traveled to about 18 countries across Africa to find and look for and support tech startups, which was really, really cool. And so, I'm very much invested into the tech space on the continent.
What's exciting is that I did a podcast with Katlego, who is the CEO of Yoko.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So I guess the audience is quite familiar with the company.
Cool.
And for those who haven't listened to it, you can check out episode number 50. So I think what I would like to chat to you about more is to do with the tech in Africa. When did you come to join Seedstars?
So I joined Seedstars at the beginning of 2015. Wow. But my first kind of encounter with the tech space on the continent was in 2013 when I did a trip called Startup Bus. It was an absolutely crazy trip. We basically flew to Harare, and then from there we took a bus and drove all the way to Cape Town and did a hackathon on the bus. So starting in Harare, 4 days of traveling on the road with about 30 people. It was half people from Africa and the other half was from abroad. And on that trip, we just coded away and came up with crazy projects, but also stopped along the way at different hubs and incubators and co-working spaces on the continent. And that was really where my kind of imagination popped open. I'm like, wow, there's so much stuff happening. There's so many incredible people working on crazy things. And that was really when my kind of passion, or at that point it was an interest for the tech ecosystem on the continent was sparked. And back then I was still working in San Francisco, and then more and more I became interested in what's happening on the continent, but I didn't really know how to get involved and what to do and how to go about it. And then the Seedstars opportunity came along. They basically looked for someone who can help them scale the Africa operation of the competition, but also then gradually build up the network and the context to do investments and accelerator programs and things like that. And so I jumped on the opportunity, and I jumped on a plane. My job description was figure out Africa for Seedstars.
Yeah.
And I did that as best as I could. And managed to go to about 18 countries, which was an amazing experience.
So from what you've seen in your experience, of course, it's a very short period from when you started to this point. What has changed?
The main thing to me is what's changing faster and faster and faster and accelerating all the time is two things. One, the professionalization of the businesses across the continent. Mm-hmm. And number two is the general interest in entrepreneurship and startups on the continent, specifically in tech.
Right.
What that means is that you're starting to see more and more sophisticated companies run by more and more sophisticated and experienced entrepreneurs that are meeting more and more people who are interested in supporting. So that means, bigger investments, more support programs, more networks for people to engage with. And that, I think, has changed a lot. I mean, 3 years ago, if you were saying that an African company would raise a $10 million Series A round, people would have laughed at you. And now you have your Andelas that have done that. You have other companies that have raised even more. I don't think necessarily that the amount of funding is always an indicator of success, but it's definitely an indicator of someone has the trust and the belief that money is well spent. And I think that's a really important sign and a really important signaling value to other people that, people are believing in what's coming out of the continent. And it's super encouraging for people to get involved and do their own thing.
And for that period, what are the startups that stand out to you where you're like, okay, this is great?
Look, there's way too many. I think what I always find interesting is when you meet startups that you just wouldn't have expected to come from a certain place, right? So, for example, when we went to Mali, there was a company that has basically found a way to transmit X-rays and other like medical documents in a much more efficient way to help rural doctors and hospitals talk to, like the hospitals in the city where all the equipment is. You see companies building drones in Tanzania. You see, people working on absolutely interesting hardware stuff. We met this guy in Mozambique who built a TV streaming box that doesn't just stream movies from the internet, but basically builds a mesh network with other TV streaming boxes. So you can essentially start watching things without having to use the internet because you're streaming from other boxes.
It doesn't make sense to me, but it sounds really cool. It sounds complicated.
It's almost like a BitTorrent network.
Oh, it's a peer-to-peer.
But based on a hardware device that connects to your TV. So rather than streaming Game of Thrones from the internet, you basically stream it from your neighbor's box.
Oh, okay.
And so you're not relying on, slow internet. You're not relying on like any of this stuff. And it just makes everything so much easier. And so you end up seeing these things that if I showed them to you and I told you they're from Silicon Valley, you wouldn't like doubt it for a second.
Yeah, for sure.
But then they come from places where, if I asked you, is there innovation in Mozambique? You'd probably say no. Yeah. And that's what I really find exciting is when you see incredible, like top-notch stuff coming from places that you would never expect these things to come from. And it's changing the narrative of what's possible on the continent. And that to me is super exciting. And these were the things that always kind of blew me away.
Yeah, that's cool. That TV box is really cool. What's the company called?
It's called Black Box TV.
Black Box TV. I should definitely look it up.
Yeah.
Now in South Africa, right now, what's kind of like the ecosystem? I mean, first of all, how do you compare the South African ecosystem for now with the rest of Africa?
So it always depends on what you compare it on, right? I think South Africa has a very, very big advantage in a few areas. First of all, the education system is so much better than a lot of other African countries. So, out of the top 10 universities across the continent, I think 6 or 7 are in South Africa. So the talent pool you have available is incredible, which is, the most important thing for startups to thrive. Secondly, the funding landscape is fairly good. Of course, there's more that can be done, but the amount of capital you have in the country is mind-blowing. And not just South African capital, but also other African wealthy people have their money in South Africa. So it's almost like the Switzerland of Africa to some extent. Right. So there's a lot of capital here, a lot of economic activity here. So that's, of course, very positive for the ecosystem. And then the other thing is you have a big influx of foreign like talent, attention, support, whatever, which I think is adding a lot as well. So to me, in terms of, if you look at the sophistication of ideas, South Africa is probably the furthest ahead on the continent, but other countries are catching up super quickly. If you're looking at what's coming out of Nigeria, there's really, really cool companies that are starting to be built. If you're looking at, I think Ethiopia is a very interesting place as well. What South Africa doesn't have is a domestic market that's big enough if you really want to make it. Because if you compare, for example, Nigeria has 180 million people, and South Africa has 55. And then if you take the kind of economically active population in South Africa, you get to close to like 25 very quickly. So South Africa is for me, I would always say it's a great place to start, but you need to look outside of South Africa very quickly, and not just at Europe and the US. There's much more than that.
What I would like to know is, in general, what are the challenges faced by a lot of African startups, say, except South Africa?
So it's very different depending on the country, but generally speaking, infrastructure is an issue. So for example, if you're in Nigeria or in Ghana and you have an incredibly unreliable power supply, and I know that South Africans think their power supply is unreliable, but if you're in Nigeria and power trips 9 times a day and there's no load shedding schedule, but it's just random and you don't know if it comes back in an hour or in a minute or in a day or in a week, that is really disruptive.
Yeah.
So you're facing infrastructure challenges to some extent. You're facing talent challenges. So the availability of talent is still very, very limited, and the appeal of corporates is very high. So a lot of the very, very educated people end up going into corporate because of the money,
right.
because of that. And to some extent, you also have that in South Africa. And then I think in a lot of countries, you still have a big cultural block towards people not going into entrepreneurship, because people say, like, it's not a job. You're looking into a laptop, so you're not working.
Rather be a doctor.
Exactly. Go be a doctor, go be a lawyer, go be this, go be that. So that's adding, I think, a lot to the pressure and the challenges. And the other thing that people would also say a lot is just funding. Like, when you're starting out, you need a little bit of money to get going. And not everyone had the luxury of having a job before to put some money on the side, or have parents that can be your first angel investors. And so just the capital to get going is also really, really tough to find sometimes.
So I grew up in Malawi, for example, right? And I still see that in most African countries, the cultural aspect of whatever is happening there has a huge impact on business and entrepreneurship. Just because of the things that people believe in kind of affects the way they do things, or the things that they would be interested in, or they would be able to join.
Absolutely.
How do you think that could change? Because that's kind of a deep problem. It's deeper than funding, because funding would change.
Exactly. I think it's essentially about role models, and I think that's really the important part. And it needs to be not just random role models, but relatable role models. Mm-hmm. We all hype up your Mark Zuckerbergs and your Elon Musks and whatever. But at the end of the day, if you grow up in Malawi, then identifying yourself with Steve Jobs and thinking that this could be you, it's very far apart, right? So I think we need to work much harder at having local and relatable success stories and role models that people can look at and say, this could be me. I can see how I could get from where I am now to where he or she is now. And I think we're not doing that enough. We're not celebrating our own successes enough. We're still looking at your Elon Musks and your Jack Ma's and all these guys, and they've accomplished an incredible amount, and it's important to learn from them. But I think we need to learn from the people who have figured it out here and done things here, because that is what people can relate to. If you start a startup in your dorm room in Harvard, that's not a scenario that most people can identify with.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's something we need to work on much more, because what's going to do is, first of all, it's going to encourage people to try, because they're like, if he did it, I can. But second of all, it's also going to show to parents and family that there's more career paths than just doctors and lawyers. The problem is everyone in your family knows a doctor, knows a lawyer, they know the fancy car they're driving around. So it's an easy thing to...
It's relatable.
Correct. It's relatable. And the doctor grew up across the street, so, if you grow up there, you can make it too.
He's like the Elon Musk of that area, right?
Correct. He's the Elon Musk of the area. But we need more Elon Musks, and we need more local Elon Musks and relatable Elon Musks. Like, I always cringe when I go to startup conferences or events focused on African tech, and then they talk about Elon Musk as an African entrepreneur. And I know it's technically correct.
Correct, yeah.
But it's also not.
I totally agree with you. Brothers maybe speak of Wale Dangote to some level, but also that's another different story.
Correct, yeah.
Because, like you said, a story of starting your startup in a dorm room would be way much different from someone who grew up in a household without electricity or clean water.
Correct.
Yeah. And another thing is, what have you seen as government support? Because personally, I feel like they're far way behind as far as supporting tech startups specifically, or just startups in general.
So I have very conflicted opinions about this. I think the first question for me is, should government support startups? And I'm not too sure about that. I think the government's role is to create an environment that makes it okay for startups to work. Right. To give you a very specific example, if as a startup it becomes a 3-month process just to incorporate, and then from the moment you incorporate it, you're hit with like a 40% tax rate because the tax code doesn't have a provision for young companies, that is something the government needs to solve. If there's no spaces where people can work that have proper internet connectivity, no infrastructure, that is something government can solve. Government should not going and like invest in a company. That's not their role. So for me, government's role is really to support the creation of the environment and build almost like the platform for people to start working and take all the roadblocks out of the way. Mm-hmm. But then it's up to the individual. So are governments doing that? Not as much as they should. I mean, you're starting to see governments being very involved, but in a lot of cases, it's very, very much PR focused. So, for example, the Nigerian president has his own demo day. So he invites like 10 startups a year to his house, and they pitch to the president. Last year, Mark Zuckerberg was one of the judges. So it's like super high profile, but then it's not what the government should do. Yeah. The president of Kenya has been like walking into iHub a lot of times. But then, then they introduce bills that make, like entrepreneurs and startups really, really hard to run. So there's a lot of lip service, there's a lot of talking, but I don't see them building that infrastructure well enough. Interestingly enough, in South Africa, there's actually a lot of support structures that you can access from the government. The problem is just they're really tough to find. Right. And they're really tedious in terms of application process. So the government has a lot of funds that they have to invest in companies. But if you need to hire someone for a month to fill in the application because it's 600 pages, you're not going to do it, right? Because you don't have the capacity. So I don't see them doing enough, with the only exception being Rwanda. I think what Rwanda is doing for innovation in general is really impressive. And it starts with simple things. One, they now have visa-free entry for all African passport holders. So it's one of the few countries on the continent where you can literally just, if you have an African passport, show up at the border and they let you in.
Rwanda, you said?
Rwanda, yeah.
I should be there next year then.
Yeah, you should definitely go. It's a fantastic place. The government has invested an insane amount in infrastructure, fiber, mobile networks, roads, all sorts of things. And they're now building, they've put the whole government system on, they've turned the whole government into e-government. So now, for example, if you want to request a birth certificate, you can literally do it with a USSD shortcode on a phone.
Right.
So you don't have to go anywhere, you don't have to do anything. They've now built a special economic zones where manufacturing companies can come and produce products in the country, which is why I think the only laptop manufacturing plant on the continent is in Rwanda, for example.
Wow, okay.
So they actually manufacture laptops in Rwanda. And the president is constantly pushing for the country to be more innovative. They now launched a program where they use drones to deliver blood and medical equipment between hospitals. So like today you can go to Rwanda and there's drones flying around.
Really?
Yeah.
And it's working?
It's working, yeah. So they're using it to transport equipment between hospitals, because a lot of the hospitals are in rural areas, the roads are not good. And so they need a blood supply in a rural hospital. They take it in Kigali, they put it on a drone, they send a drone, it drops it off at the hospital, and stuff arrives in 20 minutes rather than 2 days.
Right.
And that's something that's, supported and sponsored by the government, which is incredible. So Rwanda is probably one of the examples of countries that have done an incredible job. For the other countries, it's either lip service or there is support, but it's just so incredibly hard to access that people choose not to.
Yeah, like on that point, that I actually meant exactly what you said, of just the government giving trying to create an ecosystem where startups can thrive. But then on the funding side as well, I was listening to Vusi Temekwayo from South Africa, and he was saying exactly what you're talking about of the applying process, for example. It's like 600 pages long. And for someone who is coming from Soweto in South Africa, they're not even familiar with it. Like, he just wants to run his business. It makes it very hard just to get access to the funding, as well as it makes it harder even for the government to actually invest in the right startups, because some people would just study the right way to actually approach the funders, and they would get it, even though the company is probably not legit.
Yeah, and then sometimes these processes are run by bureaucrats who don't know how startups work.
Absolutely.
So now, even if you went through the process, you're a startup, you're just starting out, you have an idea, you have a prototype, and they ask you to submit a 15-year financial projection.
Yeah.
And it's like, of course, it sounds useful on paper, but people end up making it up.
Yeah.
Because if you only have a prototype, how are you going to know your profit to the cent in 2032? But they're going to require it. So you just end up making things up, and then it doesn't help anyone. So if the process is long, if the process is run by the wrong people with the wrong mindset, you're really not helping anyone, and it's not doing anything for the startups either.
And what are the places that you would recommend that if you're interested in startups, what are the places besides Rwanda in Africa where you could say, look, this is where you could visit maybe and see some cool stuff happening?
So I think you can see cool stuff anywhere. The places I'm most excited about besides Rwanda is one, Ethiopia, for the reason that it's essentially the last country left on earth that has a population of 100 million people and is essentially a state-run monopoly. No other place in the world has that kind of setup.
Sorry, just explain a little bit more on that.
Sure.
For other people who don't understand.
So in Ethiopia, you can't trade the currency internationally, for example. The currency is its own thing. There's only one telco. There's essentially the banks are state-run. The whole business landscape is more or less state-run, and they've been completely shielded off from foreign influence. So like, besides Coca-Cola, you don't find any foreign brands in the country. You don't have a McDonald's, you don't have a Starbucks, you don't have anything. There's no MTN, there's no, none of the things you find there, which has basically created a massive market that's served only domestically. But at the same time, it's only a matter of time until the market is going to open up. Yeah. And then there's going to be a massive flood of opportunity coming into the country if as an outsider. But at the same time, for now, essentially a lot of the innovation that's happening in the country is coming locally. So there's no like Ubers or Taxifys or things like that go into the country. So there's a massive opportunity to do stuff. And that's something that's really fascinating, and people are taking it up because you're looking at a domestic market of 100 million people, a GDP that's growing 10% a year or something like that. So you're having an incredibly attractive market that is, if you're inside, shielded off from the outside. So it's a very interesting competitive environment. So Ethiopia is super interesting. The other place I would look into is Abidjan in Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast is having like a post-Civil War economic spike. It's growing incredibly fast. And again, because it's a French-speaking country, a lot of things happen locally for the local market. So there's a lot of very unique things coming out of there. People are super entrepreneurial and doing incredible stuff. So I think these two are really interesting. And then if you go further to North Africa, I think Egypt and Morocco are incredibly exciting as well in terms of the startup quality that's coming out. Specifically, Egypt is, when we talk about Africa, most of the times people mean sub-Saharan Africa. But if you add Egypt to that, it's also power.
So I'm fascinated by Ethiopia, what you said. I didn't know that.
Yeah, most people don't.
Is it a good or bad thing? Or is it depending on how you look at it?
It depends on how you look at it. You could now go into all sorts of like political discussions, and I think this is not the time and place to have it. No. But the way I look at it is, because of the situation, there's an incredible opportunity for people in the market to do things, which to me is a good thing. And because of the situation, at some point down the road, there will be an incredible opportunity for people outside the market to move into the market, which is a good thing as well. Yeah, the rest is political.
That's like the China of Africa on its own somehow.
To some extent, yeah. It's an interesting comparison, yeah.
I'm definitely going to Rwanda next year to see the drones.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, man. And how is it going at Yoko? What's new? What's coming up in Cape Town? For sure, you're killing it. But I'm not from Joburg, so I don't know how much you guys are doing here.
At Yoko, we've opened our new office in Joburg in May. So this is the first time we have a full-time presence in Gauteng. It's going incredibly well. The team has grown here. We've recently hit the big milestone of having 10,000 merchants in South Africa,
wow,
which now makes us the biggest mobile point of sale company that's not a bank. So that's incredibly exciting. And yeah, we're now essentially busy preparing, expanding to new countries. And we should be piloting in one country before the end of the year, which is very, very cool, and I'm very excited about.
Which country is that going to be?
We're looking at East Africa.
East Africa.
Exactly.
Nice. Kenya?
We'll see.
Okay. And what are your thoughts, since you're into the fintech side of things and into Africa, what are your thoughts on cryptocurrency or Bitcoin specifically, for example?
So, full disclaimer, I'm not an expert and I don't know much about Bitcoin as a whole. My observation as an interested outsider is I'm very excited to see the applications of Bitcoin that are not currency related. So, to give you examples, there's a company in Ghana that's using the blockchain to do title deeds for land. So basically build a register of who owns what piece of land based on the blockchain. That kind of stuff is super exciting. There's a company called BitPesa that's using Bitcoin to transfer money between countries in Africa. Also really interesting because they're basically using the easier tradability of the currency and the lower transaction fees to make cross-border payments work better. There's a company in South Africa called Custos that's using blockchain and Bitcoin to incentivize people to report pirated movies. They basically hide, and I don't know how it works, but they basically hide cash in movies. And when people find the cash, it basically reports who the uploader was.
Yeah.
And then the people get rewarded for finding who uploaded it, and the movie studios find out who uploaded it and can make sure that that person gets prosecuted or whatever it might be. So to me, Bitcoin blockchain has incredible potential, but I'm really more excited about what people are going to use it for outside of the currency and trading space, but how people are going to apply it in interesting ways that people wouldn't have thought of.
There's another blockchain, it's called Ethereum.
Yeah.
It's based on the blockchain. I guess that's going to do a lot of that stuff because it has smart contracts embedded to it. So
exactly.
Yeah. But as a currency, say, with the problems that Zimbabwe has been facing lately, do you think having a decentralized currency would help?
The big promise of a decentralized currency is that there's not one person or entity that can control it.
Yes.
Which, of course, makes a lot of sense theoretically when you look at countries like Zimbabwe, what they've done to their currency and how other countries are manipulating their currency to be more or less, competitive in the global space. So it's definitely an opportunity, but then at the same time, it's also incredibly challenging because decentralized doesn't mean that necessarily no one has control over it.
Yeah, for sure.
You see, for example, with the hype that Bitcoin is having now, it's at like $4,000 a Bitcoin.
Yeah.
That is pretty close to hyperinflation as well, if you look at the growth chart of Bitcoin. So you're not necessarily avoiding these problems. You're just not making them in the area of control of a certain country or government, which is probably not a bad idea. But then you're gonna get into new problems. It's like how do you deal with it when it's completely decentralized and nobody has control over it? And also for me, the flip side is what's gonna happen to countries when they don't have control over the currencies?
Yeah.
Because it's a massive limit to your sovereignty as a country if now all of a sudden you don't have your own currency, you can't control your currency, you can't,
control transfers
anything, right? It's if I was in government, I'd be scared.
They should be scared. I'm sure they are. But the thing is, they're not doing anything about it from my point of view,
Yeah, but it's one of these things that's tough to know what to do. I mean, for example, the central bank in Kenya last year, they put out full-page ads in newspaper warning people about the risk of Bitcoin.
Really?
And telling people that it's essentially like a Nigerian scam and they shouldn't touch it, and there's no control and all their savings can be lost. So they've tried the scare route to scare people away from Bitcoin, which is not going to work. But as a government, it's tough because you're you're standing at the bottom of the mountain and you're seeing this big boulder rolling down, and you have to stop it or do something with it, but you don't know how, because you're just like a guy seeing a big rock running towards you. So it's tough. I don't know exactly what governments can do. If I were in their shoes, I'd be scared. But the opportunity for progress in general is massive with Bitcoin. I just like us to talk about it less as a currency and more as a technology and a protocol for different things. At the same time, I also think there's a little bit of a hype around Bitcoin, and people are looking at what can I use Bitcoin for, and they don't really think about, does it make sense? I'm starting to see job platforms coming up that are based on blockchain.
Yes.
And I mean, that's where my understanding of the technology ends, but I don't understand how the blockchain is going to make finding a job significantly easier, right? So I also think there's a bit of let me find something to then add blockchain and Bitcoin to without thinking about if it makes sense or not, which is not healthy either. But I think as with every new technology, it's almost like a pendulum, right? It becomes super, super exciting, super hyped. Then there's a bit of an area of disillusionment, so it goes a little bit back, and then it comes back. So that's, I think, the normal progression of new technologies and new innovations. We'll see where it goes.
Great. Thanks, how do you pronounce it?
It's Marcello.
Marcello, not Marcello. Okay, thanks, Marcello.
Cool. You're welcome. Thank you so much.
And lastly, guys, before you take off, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you on the next episode. If you think this was helpful and deserves more listens to a lot of people out there, please remember to share it on your social media. You can tweet about it, you can send a link to a friend or something like that. You can also support this podcast by giving it a 5-star review on iTunes. And remember to subscribe. You can do it many ways. We're on SoundCloud, iTunes. I have a website where you can also subscribe from there. Then you'll be able to receive emails whenever I have a new guest. Then I can tell you who is coming next, and I send you questions about what do you think I should ask them or we should talk about. So it's just a cool way to be part of the community and to grow this together. With that, I'll leave you to it. Enjoy and stay awesome.